Lesson 102, the predicate nominative. Catherine, we've been telling our listeners that action verbs and verbs of being are going to behave differently in the ways that they interact with the other words around them. And so now we've arrived at that point where we need to start talking about some of the specifics of how that's going to work out in Greek grammar. An action verb is going to interact in one way with the nouns around it, but a verb of being is going to interact in a different way. So there's a sort of a dividing line between the behavior of verbs of being and action verbs.
Mm-hmm.
What is that dividing line? How specifically do they act differently and interact differently? That's what we're going to talk about here in Lesson 102. So in the last lesson, Catherine, we talked about the direct object, and we talked about the fact that an action verb can perform action on a noun, and the target of the action, we call that a direct object. So an action verb, when the activity is done to a noun, that noun that's the recipient of the action or the target of the action, we call that a direct object. Now, in this lesson, we're going to draw a contrast with that and talk about the difference between that kind of activity and the kind of thing that a verb of being can do. So we need to draw a distinction here. And so the theme of this lesson is the predicate nominative. So we got to talk about what is a predicate nominative, how does it interact with a verb of being, and how is that different from the scheme I mentioned a minute ago with an action verb plus a direct object. So we need to unpack some of this because I would argue that this is actually a pretty important concept for any student of Greek grammar. It's seemingly, at first glance, you might think, oh, big deal, not too big of a thing. But I would actually argue that this is a pretty important concept for a Greek student to know, especially a beginner, because it's going to have implications for the way more complicated structures work later. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I would also say that this is an important concept for a Greek student to learn early on because it is not a concept that is talked about very much in English. And so it can be a little more difficult for a student of Greek whose native language is English. It can be a little more difficult to understand early on, and therefore it's important to kind of emphasize because it is so common in Greek and because it is something that is going to affect how sentences work down the line in a way that Greek will just assume that you know how it works. And so it's important to get it now. Again, that investment now, payoff later idea.
And Catherine, as you were talking a minute ago, I was thinking in my mind of different, more advanced Greek grammatical structures in which this actually is a big deal because you have to keep up with what is working with a verb of being and what is working more with an action verb. Of course, they'll learn all that in the future, but suffice it to say that this is something that you're going to keep in your back pocket as you go on into future, more complicated Greek stuff. So this isn't really just a side issue. This is really a kind of a big important thing for our listeners to grasp. So let's start to break this down here. We have two example sentences. Fred chased the dog. And then we have Fred is a dog. And so we have the word dog here twice, once in each sentence. In the first sentence, the word dog is a direct object. In the second sentence, the word dog is a predicate nominative.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to help our listeners understand why it's one thing in one sentence and why it's the other thing in the other sentence. And I think if they can grasp this, it will become clear and they'll be able to carry on with it on their own as they progress forward.
And the main difference is, as you pointed out, the verbs. In the first sentence, Fred chased the dog. Chased is an action verb. Dog is the target of the action verb. Fred is doing the chasing, and what is he chasing? He's chasing the dog. Dog is the direct object. Okay, great.
And I explained that in lesson 101. I took quite a bit of time to explain that, so our listeners can go back to 101 if they really need to hear all that again.
In the second example sentence, The verb is not an action verb. The verb is a verb of being. And as we talked about in previous lessons, verbs of being are almost like equal signs. So Fred is, i.e., is the same as a dog. So Fred is a dog. It's not that Fred is performing an action by being a dog, he just is a dog.
Like if I say 2 plus 2 is 4, that's the same as if I said 2 plus 2 equals 4. So in that sense, is the same as an equal sign. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. So that's kind of what you're saying when you say that is basically like an equals sign.
And just like in a math equation, 2 plus 2 and 4, 2 plus 2 is not doing anything. It just is 4. Here, Fred is a dog. So in this case, there's no action being performed. And so there's no action to go toward a target. And so dog in the second example sentence is not a direct object. It's what's called a predicate nominative. Predicate nominatives are nouns that work with verbs of being and are basically, if you're imagining that verb of being as an equal sign again, the subject is on one side of the equal sign and the predicate nominative is on the other side of the equal sign, and they need to line up. And so the predicate nominative is telling you exactly what the subject is. It's not having any action done to it. It's just telling you what the subject is. It's giving you more information.
But you could see how a beginner might mistake it for a direct object. Like let's say you're a beginner, a student who's learning some of these concepts for the first time. It's conceivable that you would look at that second sentence and say, Fred is a dog. Well, the word dog is a direct object because Fred is being it. So in the sense of he's being a dog, he's kind of doing something to the dog, right?
That's a very common beginner mistake and very easy to make. I made it as a beginner all the time.
So it's conceivable it's understandable that a beginner might make that kind of mistake.
And so that is why you've been so clear in the book about the difference between a verb of being and an action verb, so that it helps the listener not have that confusion.
Quick review. If you have an action verb doing action to a noun, that generates a direct object. But if you have a verb of being and someone is just being a noun, that generates a predicate nominative. So earlier in the book, when we were talking about how action verbs and verbs of being interact differently with the words around them, this is what we were talking about. This is the nuts and bolts of how that works. So, Catherine, before we go, let's do a couple of selected exercises to help our readers along to grasp this important concept. In number 1, Fluffy is our dog. The word is a verb of being, not an action verb. It's a verb of being. So Fluffy is just being the dog. With a verb of being like that, you can't generate a direct object. That requires an action verb. So when Fluffy is being something, he just is our dog. The word dog here is a predicate nominative. And by the way, in every sentence, the word dog, that's the operative word here. You have to figure out what the word dog is doing. So for number 1, the word dog is a predicate nominative because it's being generated by a verb of being. Catherine, tell us what's behind curtain number 2.
So, exercise number 2 is actually a direct object. Dog is a direct object here because the cat chased the dog. Chased is an action verb, and so it is doing something to the noun dog. And so it's a direct object.
Same thing in number 3. We saw the dog. The verb here is saw. Now, there's not a whole lot of action involved in seeing something. You're just, looking at it or perceiving it. But nevertheless, from a grammatical standpoint, it is an action. You're doing something to the dog. And so therefore, grammatically speaking, the word dog here is a direct object.
Right. Basically, action verb means a verb that is not a verb of being.
Right. Even if it's some inconsequential action like just thinking or seeing or something like that, it's still technically, grammatically speaking, an action verb.
Right.
Skipping ahead to number 6, a golden retriever is a dog. The verb here is a verb of being. A verb of being cannot generate a direct object. So the word dog here cannot be a direct object. Instead, it's just merely saying that a golden retriever is a dog. So the golden retriever is just being a dog, and therefore the word dog here, grammatically speaking, is called a predicate nominative.